So, the question is, are Labour's plans to increase defence spending too slow? That's what former generals have been telling us here on Times Radio as Keir Starmer heads to the NATO summit in Washington. Times Radio's political editor Kate McCann is travelling with the Prime Minister.
Speaking to Keir Starmer on the plane over here overnight, he is clear that the hospital bombing in Ukraine has really set the tone for this summit. He said it strengthened the resolve of NATO allies, and it's a very important, if tragic, backdrop to this summit. That was him, in his own words, speaking to journalists on the plane. And I think for Keir Starmer, there is a real determination here to show that the UK is still absolutely steadfast, united with Ukraine, behind the Ukrainians as they try and fend off that Russian aggression. And Keir Starmer clear as well, it's not just aggression from Russia in terms of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, but also cyber warfare. So, you know, a clear signal that the UK is going to continue to be tough on Russia as we move through the next couple of years. But there are still questions for the UK domestically, including on defence spending. Keir Starmer has committed to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence, although many military figures have told Times Radio over the last 24 hours that that will not be enough. He's yet to give a timeline, and he was pushed on that on the plane ride over here. Again, didn't commit to a timeline, but said that he would review defence and security in the UK and do that as quickly as possible, hopefully within a year, quicker than a year if he can, I think, which is Keir Starmer showing that he understands the importance of that mission, I think. But in terms of who else is here from the UK, the Defence Secretary, John Healey, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, and Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's the Minister for EU Relations. And that last name is an interesting one because it perhaps hints at a determination from the UK to forge closer ties with the EU on defence and security. Nick Thomas-Symonds being here says that some of those meetings are going to happen much quicker than they would have done maybe if he wasn't here, if he waited to try and do those meetings individually. So perhaps an indication from the new government that the EU is going to be a really important part of defence and security in the months and years ahead. But again, you know, as ever with big UK trips, that special relationship, and that is what Keir Starmer referred to it as, is going to be front and centre here at the NATO summit in Washington.
That's Kate McCann, who just landed in Washington, D.C. Sir Richard Dearlove is the former head of Britain's MI6 spy agency. We're delighted to say he joins us now. Good morning to you, Richard.
Good morning, Stig.
There is something of a cliche that we are living in an ever more dangerous world as the years go by. How much do you subscribe to that?
I certainly subscribe to that as an analysis at the moment. We've lived through dangerous periods before, but this probably is the worst during my adult career. Probably the worst during my life was the Cuba crisis when I was at school on the east coast of the United States.
And what's the reason for that?
Well, it's quite clear we have a major war on the European continent, and I think people of my generation would not have imagined that that was possible without it escalating into more serious European conflict. And it's not just that war on its own, it's the wider dimensions like Chinese support for Russia, the support of Iran, the support of North Korea. So we're looking at a complex series of relationships which imply a much more serious security situation than we've seen in many years.
Have we failed? Has the West failed collectively to deal with the threat of Putin? In terms of Ukraine, it began in 2014 when he invaded Crimea, obviously got more serious with the full Ukrainian invasion. Is that a failure to circumscribe him in some way?
Yeah, I think the West closed its eyes to the escalation of the problem. And you've got to remember that this war did start in 2014. And the West didn't take a tough line with Putin at the time. I think it could have been much more clear cut in the pressure that it put on Russia. It's only after the February 22 invasion of Ukraine that I think the West suddenly woke up to the seriousness of the situation they're dealing with.
And how that war has then been prosecuted, how do you feel about that? Because at one level, he is as strong as he's ever been. That feels like a dangerous point. On the other, it has not escalated. It has not led to World War III. It has not led to a wider conflict in Europe. Is that luck or success, or how would you account for that?
Well, I think NATO's been very careful not to as it were, make Russia's war with Ukraine a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. And I mean, that's NATO's dilemma, as it were, to support Ukraine as much as possible. In my view, not enough, not quickly enough. So we've always been behind the curve since this conflict escalated with the direct invasion. We've put restraints on how the Ukrainians should use their weapon systems. We've supplied them grudgingly, added to, as the war has got more intense, we've allowed a bit more. I think the dilemma now for NATO is it needs really to throw huge resources at this without getting into a direct conflict with Russia.
Are we scared? I mean, it's an interesting point, that, isn't it? Because the question of how do you deter Vladimir Putin if he never believes there will be a full conflict? Which is, I'm sure, the correct decision. It's a nuclear power after all. We all know the tremendous downsides of a direct conflict. But if that's always off the table, the deterrent effect doesn't exist.
I think it does, because if NATO could concentrate its resources and coordinate its resources, it massively outweighs Russia's capabilities. And it hasn't really done that. I mean, if you take the German commitment, I mean, okay, they've been a big supplier, but they could be an even larger supplier. The United States has delayed, not put forward all the weapon systems. Now we get a new promise. We need to be much more clear-cut in our objectives. We need to be much more supportive of Ukraine. I mean, obviously, the coordination can be done through NATO. The relationships have to be conducted bilaterally. It's complex, but, there is an answer to squaring this circle. And at the moment, we're just not quite doing that. So we're always falling slightly short. And if you talk to the senior leadership of Ukrainian intelligence, it's quite clear that they see as part of their strategy a clear path to NATO membership. That, for them, is an essential element, as it were, in winning this war. Well, winning may be too strong a phrase, but coming out on top. We cannot allow Putin to achieve his objectives, and we have the means to sort of escalate the cost to Russia to a point where I think the burden on Russia becomes intolerable.
So that's the outcome, because we often talk about what is the correct outcome here. The outcome here is what? Ukraine succeeding in the war effort because they're so backed by the West that it becomes too much of a burden on Russia. And they do what? They come out of Crimea, they come out of the Donbass region, they're out of Ukrainian territory entirely. Is that a plausible... I mean, you know the Russian mentality, you know the mentality of people who run Russia. Is that actually a plausible outcome that they'll ever be willing to give up and withdraw?
I don't think that Ukraine can recover all of its territory. It can probably recover some of it. I mean, I'm trying to be pragmatic.
Yeah, of course.
But what we don't want is a negotiation that ends this war where Russia is on the front foot.
Yeah.
If it goes to negotiation, Russia has to be on the back foot, and seriously on the back foot, and we're nowhere near that. But the cost to Russia in terms of armaments, casualties, is huge. And of course, the cost to the Russian economy is huge. And Russia is in serious sort of post-imperial decline. It hasn't, okay, it has depth and it has quantity, but it doesn't have limitless strength. And, Russia has lost wars in the past. And we have to remember that historically. And this war was a huge mistake. And the longer it goes on, I think the more problems the Russian leadership will face amongst themselves in, as it were, continuing it. But that depends on NATO really upping their game hugely in supplying and training the Ukrainians.
And that might mean countries going to spending more on defence. We were having this debate about when to get to 2.5%.
I think one of the really terrible things about the election campaign was the fact that neither party really described to the voters the seriousness of the situation that we face at the moment. In my view, actually, our defense expenditure should be around 3%, maybe even a bit higher. The polls are already spending 3.9% and going to go even higher. There is an urgency. This is a major problem. It's more important, and people won't accept this from me, it's more important than the National Health Service, I'm sorry.
Well, on that note, it's very clearly put, Richard. We're very grateful to you for speaking to us.
Great. Thank you very much, Dick.
That's Richard Dearlove, the former head of Britain's MI6 spy agency. At the end, they're saying we should be spending 3%. Spending money on this is more important than the National Health Service.
This war was a huge mistake. And the longer it goes on, I think the more problems the Russian leadership will face amongst themselves in, as it were, continuing it